Hi everybody and welcome back. Today we're going to talk about investigative profiling. Alright? And this is referred to as a lot of different topics: criminal profiling, criminal behavior analysis, investigative profiling. And it's basically what the TV show Criminal Minds is based on. So what is investigative profiling? Well, investigative profiling is the use of psychological principles as a crime investigation technique to guide police towards suspects who possess certain personal characteristics as revealed by the way a crime was committed. Essentially, the basic premise is that the way a person thinks directs that person's behavior. And if we can see certain behavioral patterns, then we can know how they think or what makes them tick or whatever the case may be. Now, there's been a lot of debate as to whether or not this is actually appropriate for a course in psychology. And the reason for that is twofold. I suppose there's arguments for both, right? Yes, there are appropriate topics for this to be included in a course in psychology and law, and there are some issues that aren't, right? So first of all, under the yes category is appropriate, there are psychological analyses of criminal behavior that happen, right? And there's also an application of psychological concepts to the legal system. And so in those ways, this topic is very appropriate for a course in psychology and law. But in a lot of ways it's not, right? First of all, training is controlled by the FBI, and there's only about 20 people in the entire FBI who do this. And so the availability of jobs is extremely limited. And so for those of you who hopefully one day want to be an investigative profiler, understand that not only do you have to get into the FBI to do it, but even within the FBI, this is a very, very small pool of people that actually do it. Also, the majority of those who profile in the U.S. do not do graduate work in psychology. And with that being said, even experienced profilers will acknowledge that profiling is much more of an art than it is an actual science. And we'll talk about that as we go through this. Hopefully you guys also did the reading for this week that helped demonstrate that final point as well. So there are a lot of different approaches to investigative profiling. One of them is to distinguish the quote-unquote evil person, right? So understanding the behavior and motivations of individuals who played a role in important events. There's also determining common characteristics. For example, we might seek consistencies in the personalities, backgrounds, and behaviors of offenders who carry out similar crimes, so that when the next crime like that happens, we can get a rough guess about what that kind of person is like. And then there's also extracting specific characteristics. So we generate hypotheses about the type of person who committed the crime, then seek individuals who possess the characteristics of this quote-unquote type. And so if you look at this, right, from an FBI crime scene analysis standpoint, there's 6 basic steps that happen. Step number 1 is there's profiling inputs, right? So if you're a profiler, you collect and assess materials and information. And then there's a decision process model where you arrange that information into some sort of a logical pattern, right? So you look at all of these different evidence and you say, well, this evidence has to fit in a logical pattern. And there are certain things that make sense, right? Like the law of superposition, right? Whatever's on top is probably the newest. And so you can arrange stuff in a logical way. And then there's crime assessment, right? And this is where you reconstruct the sequence of events and specific behaviors of both the victim and the perpetrator, right? And so you try and figure out, how did these two interact with each other? How did these two behave around each other and stuff, to try and figure out what happened. At that point is when the criminal profile is made, right? And so this is the process of providing a list of background, physical, and behavioral characteristics of the perpetrator, right? Once you've decided how the crime happened, you determine what kind of person would commit that crime. Then there's an investigation, and then there's apprehension. Now, one of the things that's super important to note about when we talk about serial killers or anything else is there are 2 words that are used somewhat interchangeably that probably shouldn't be. And these are modus operandi and signature. All right, the modus operandi, that's the standard kind of procedure, or the MO, if you will, right? And this might change as the offender becomes more sophisticated, right? If you think about it, the first time you shot a basketball or played tennis or something, you were probably not that good at it. You were just trying your best to make a basket, right? But as you become better and better at basketball, you might be willing to take shots from further away or change a little bit your standard shot. That's like the modus operandi. A signature, on the other hand, is different, right? This is a unique or personal aspect of a criminal act, and often the reflection of a need to express violent fantasies. and the signature will remain constant, right? So a lot of times serial rapists might take the person who they raped underwear home with them, right? And so that might be the signature of a certain rapist, right? And then criminals are also, so signatures are important, right? But criminals are also kind of categorized as either organized or disorganized offenders. Disorganized offenders tend to have lower IQ, low birth order, socially immature, seldom date, kind of your stereotypical kind of antisocial person, right? Unskilled, high anxiety during crime, lives alone, has a secret hiding place, they only come out at night because they're very insecure, right? Whereas organized offenders are very different, right? They're intelligent, they've got very masculine image, they're very charismatic or socially capable and sexually capable, right? They might live with a partner, they might be geographically mobile, and they have very, very controlled emotions during crime. And so categorizing these might help you find somebody, right? It stands to reason, right? If you just figure out characteristics of a certain crime that leads you to someone who's more disorganized, you might know it's better to probably look for them maybe at night and in the area where the crime happened because they probably live and work closer to the crime scene. Whereas if you know it's someone who's organized, you might look for somebody completely different. Now, are professional profilers actually better than other people? Well, in 1999, researchers did a study where they submitted the same material to 28 people in 5 different categories, right? They submitted materials to experts or teachers, and these are profilers who trained other law enforcement at the FBI Academy. So these are the people that train the profilers. They gave them to profilers themselves, and these are people who have been specifically trained in profiling. They gave them to detectives, and these are police who were experienced investigators, and they gave them to psychologists, so just practicing clinical psychologists who didn't know anything really about profiling, and then just undergraduates kind of as a control group, right? And the results from the study were that the trained profilers wrote longer and more detailed profiles, and their profiles of the rapist, in this case it was rape, were more correct than other groups. In the murder case, however, they fared no better on average than any of the non-profilers did, right? So for rapists, they were more correct, but that doesn't mean they were totally correct. And in murder cases, they really didn't do any better at all. So what are the problems with investigative profiling? Well, one study showed that profiling led to identification of offenders in 5 out of 184 actual cases, right? So if the profile only actually helped the police find 5 people out of 184 times a profile was used, that's a pretty small percentage. It's only really helpful maybe 2% of the time. And so it's not really super helpful in finding things, right? However, of course, police report other benefits, right? Like it furthered the understanding of the case of the offender. It also helped reassure their own conclusions with their own hunches. And it offered a kind of structure for interviewing, right? If you knew it was a disorganized offender, maybe it helped in interviewing people to say we're looking for someone who's a little more masculine, or even in interviewing that person, maybe stroke their ego a little bit before you, flip on them. However, profiles can be wildly inaccurate, right? And there are all sorts of times. If you Google profiling, especially profiling as to the Washington, D.C. shootings, they were very, very wrong about who the Washington, D.C. shooters were. Profilers were. Profilers have been very wrong about the Boston Strangler, about a lot of other pretty high-profile serial killings that have happened. Now, part of this is because of some false stereotyping in profiling, right? So bank robbers, for example, are seen as clever and skillful and glamorous, and we think of people like John Dillinger as these very suave bank robbers, right? In actuality, if you look at the characteristics of bank robbers, they're usually young, very impulsive, and they're experiencing some sort of personal crisis and are pretty desperate, which is why they're willing to carry a gun into a bank to try and steal some money, right? They're not typically these kind of larger-than-life figures that we see in our pop culture a lot. If you look at embezzlement, right? A lot of white-collar crime in general, not just embezzlement, they're seen as old, trusted employees who have worked for a firm for several years, someone like Bernie Madoff or maybe Martha Stewart or something, that they're these old, sophisticated people that just, millions of dollars just wasn't enough for them. They wanted billions. The actuality, though, is that typically, especially embezzlement, is done by the secretaries of these people. They're usually 26-year-old married white women with no more than a high school education who are working in these kind of entry-level secretarial positions for less than a year. They see all of this money that's being made, all of these guys that are pulling up in their big fancy cars, and they're driving their Pintos into work, and they decide, if we skim a little off the top, no one's going to notice. Again, though, that's not our view of white-collar crime in general. And then there's also assassins, right? Assassins are usually seen as lonely, mentally ill. They've got a single target in mind. They're trying to seek revenge for something. When in actuality, that's not true. They typically have several targets. They're professionals. And less than half of them are really mentally ill. They're just really good at killing people, right? And so because of these false stereotypes in profiling, you can see where this would really lead people in some very wrong directions if they were going to base their investigation 100% off of a profile. Some other problems with investigative profiling are that profiles may be too specific, right? They might say stuff like, and I've seen profiles even that are as specific as what the person will be wearing at the time of their apprehension. And that's just far, far, far too specific. There's no way of knowing what anyone will wear on any given day. All of my students know I usually wear a shirt and tie every single day to work, right? Over the summer, though, when I go into the office, and I'm here almost every day over the summer, I wear shorts and a polo, right? I, in fact, have seen a couple students out and about in St. Augustine in shorts and a polo, and they don't recognize me because I don't have a shirt and tie on, right? And so you never know what I'm going to look like. Even an educated guess would say probably when Josh is our Dr. Behl's in his office, he's wearing a shirt and tie. But that's not always the case, right? We may assume that if a person possesses several characteristics of the profile, he or she must be guilty also. And this is something that's a fairly big issue also, right? If you define somebody as socially awkward white male over the age of 20 but not quite 30 with a slender build, well, that could be me, right? It also could be any number of other people. In fact, most of my friends, it could be as well, right? And so just because someone fits a profile doesn't mean that they are necessarily the guilty party. So for some conclusions, right, it's not a magic bullet of investigations. It is simply just another tool, right? And it may even increase the efficient use of a detective's time, right? A profile may help guide an investigation, and that's good, like that's fine, right? Because a lot of times police operate off of hunches anyway, right? A profile is just a better hunch. It's a more educated hunch, but it's not necessarily the end-all be-all like TV shows make it seem like it should be, right? And profiles also should be used as an instrument to facilitate the work of investigators, not as a cure or as the solution to investigations. Even on TV shows like Criminal Minds, they come up with a profile, and of course on Criminal Minds they're always right about the profile, but even then it doesn't all of a sudden stop the investigation. They still need to find other evidence to make the person, to arrest the person, right, or find the person who committed the crimes. And so that's how profiling needs to be used, and that's how all of you should look at profiling. It's a tool that can be used. It's not super scientific, and on top of that, it's definitely not this kind of panacea of sorts that as long as we have a profile, we can catch the guy who did it. If anyone has any questions, as always, please let me know, and I will talk to y'all soon.